During the summer of 2022, we spent almost 6 weeks in Central Asia. We barely made a dent in the region given the very long distances between places, but we gathered enough to be able to tell a version of the story of Central Asia. To give you an idea, a train ride between Almata, the largest city in Kazakhstan, and Toshkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, takes about 18 hours. A bus ride between Toshkent and Bishkek takes about 14 hours. Also, 14 hours are needed to go from south of Kazakhstan to Karaganda in order to learn about the Soviet crimes over there. And we had to move fast because Karagandskaya Oblast has decent temperatures about 6 weeks a year. In late August, it was already cold. But at least inside Uzbekistan, there's faster rail. Sometimes, if you manage to get a ticket, you can travel 800 kilometers in under 6 hours. If not, yet another night goes just for that. 6 weeks may seem like a lot, but in a region like this, by the time you're heading to the airport to fly back to Europe, you realize you've barely scratched the surface, even if you knew where to look, and I did. So with these limitations in mind, let me introduce you slowly to how things roll around here. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the second installment of the Central Asia featured series. The term Central Asia can mean a lot of things depending on who is talking, the context in which the term is being used, and the historical period. So for instance, from a Persian perspective, most of what is today colloquially Central Asia was Turkestan. The term today refers to a specific sub-region and a specific ethnic group, but in the 7th century it simply meant the land of the Turkic peoples. Today, the name Turkestan can be controversial, especially in China, as it can be interpreted as a nod of approval to the East Turkestan independence movement, or even worse, the Turkestan Islamic Party. The former is an NGO of mostly Uyghurs, but other Turkic peoples as well, who managed to flee China and avoid the modern gulags. The latter, the Turkestan Islamic Party, is a terrorist movement, or better said, was. There is hardly any evidence of its existence since 2020, with the exception of that being asserted by the CCP as an excuse to continue the largest gulag experiment in Uyghuristan, or Xinjiang. The name Turkestan, however, is a lot less controversial outside of China. There is a city in Kazakhstan named Turkestan, which is the administrative center of Turkestan Oblast, a subdivision of Kazakhstan that was recently created in 2018. Before that, a much bigger region existed called Unsta Kazakhstan Oblast, or South Kazakhstan region. You can tell the Soviets were hardly inspired with naming places. Why do I mention this? Well, because this is one of the hotspots. The region in this circle is referred to by the locals as Turkestan. Today, the Kazakh government not only allows open discussion about this, but the topic is candidly presented even in state museums. This, in theory, is a great step forward because it allows discussion that can lead to healing, right? Well, yes and no. Once the topic was no longer taboo, things went wild because, as you can see, the historical region is now in 3 countries with 3 entirely different political regimes. Also, the capital is in Kazakhstan, the commercial centers are in Uzbekistan, and the villages are in Kyrgyzstan. Surely, Kyrgyzstan drew the short end of the stick here. But Kyrgyzstan is the only democracy-ish. More on that later. So the most vigorous discussion is there. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan is going through fundamental transformations while Uzbekistan is making sense of its new reality. Up until this morning, in historical terms, Uzbekistan was a North Korea-style personal dictatorship, with the exception that you could legally leave, if you could afford it, that is. Today, Uzbekistan is the fastest growing economy in the region. The dictator is dead, slavery was abolished, but nobody really knows what are the new limits. Discussions about Turkestan are still hush-hush, especially after what happened just before I arrived here in the far west of the country, in the region called Karakalpakstan. Feeling confused yet? Well, so did many others, which is why another perfectly acceptable way of saying Central Asia is, well, the Stans. There's just one problem with the latter name. If you say the Stans, that includes Afghanistan. Now, part of the modern territory of Afghanistan is part of the historical Turkestan region, but only a small part. And the geopolitics of the last century have effectively separated Afghanistan from the rest. The same is true for the portion of Turkestan that is on the territory of the current People's Republic of China. So, if you want to be very precise, when people say Central Asia, what they really mean is the former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tadjikistan. But that's a really long name, isn't it? Okay, so having established what we're talking about, it's worth noting that throughout this series there are 2 countries that will constantly be named besides the 5 that currently comprise the region, those being Russia and China. While we will be focusing more on the doings of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, it should be noted that this region's problems with these 2 entities predate the existence of communism by a lot. In the book General History of the Kyrgyz State, author, diplomat, historian, and former Prime Minister Osman Akum Ibrahimov documents the first quasi-state organizations of the Kyrgyz people as inherently connected to the dynasties of China, centuries before the Chinese dynasties conquered Xinjiang, and even more centuries before Mao Zedong was even born. Similarly, the colonization by Russia of the region starts in the 16th century, over 300 years before the establishment of the Soviet Union. Before we get to every country, let me tell you a little bit more about the history. Do you see this steppe? Well, that's most of Central Asia. Millions and millions and millions of square kilometers of steppe. The largest country in the region, Kazakhstan, contains almost all of the steppe. The remainder is shared with Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, while Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have the mountains. This deeply unfriendly landscape, impossible to defend steppes or uninhabitable mountains, kept the region historically marginalized. Some researchers, either heavily infected with the postmodernist virus or with an axe to grind, say that this is because of Western bigotry. But this is simply not true. The area's climate and geography is the main driver of almost all of Central Asia's history. The fact that the region is arid made agriculture difficult, historically speaking. Even today, the places where food can be produced are limited and kept under very tight military-grade security. Same with water. One place I wanted to show to you, and it used to be accessible, was this beautiful natural alpine reservoir of tectonic origin. Well, it turns out that it's also the only source of drinking water for the Almata metropolis, and tourists have been stupid in public around the lake, so Now it's off limits for everyone unless you're willing to walk half a day through 55 degrees Celsius, an offer which I respectfully declined. The region is also effectively landlocked, the largest landlocked region in the world. Yes, Kazakhstan has an opening to the Caspian Sea, but that has only become relevant in contemporaneity as the opening can be used to export gas, coal and petrol to Europe and bypass Russia, which is a highly valuable opportunity given the current geopolitical trends. In fact, Kazakhstan went as far as to create a new petrol brand to make sure nobody confuses its product with the Russian one. Nevertheless, historically, the opening at the Caspian Sea was irrelevant and the region remained cut off from much of the trade, with one exception: the Silk Road. In fact, the Silk Road is so important to the culture of this region that every major city has an important or the most important road in the city called the Silk Road Avenue. And this makes sense. Almost all major cities in the region are on the route of the historical Silk Road. The rest of the region, however, remained dominated by the nomadic horse peoples of the steppe. This, of course, created conflict. The nomadic way of doing things made the steppe people very good at warfare, and for a brief period in history, the steppe horse riders were some of the most competent military men in the world. However, the nomadic way of doing things also meant a lack of unity. The only unifying force was the Silk Road itself, which made the expansion of the major cities difficult since they always had to defend against very competent nomadic armies. How competent those armies were? Well, think Attila the Hun, the Wu Hu, and the most recent, the Mongol Empire. These three were possible primarily due to unifying the steppe people under a competent commander. They were able to wreak havoc in Europe, or what is today Russia, and also what is today China. In fact, the barbarian rebellions, or the Wu Hu, in the 4th and 5th century China had such a big impact that they get an entire chapter in the Chinese history. That's no small thing given China's very long documented history. Among other things, the Wu Hu is responsible for bringing Buddhism to China, but also for the strengthening of the Han ethnicity, the same ethnicity that runs China to this day. The southern part of China went through an economic boom due to the Han migration from the north as they were running away from the steppe people in the 4th century. Now, while this way of doing things did have an impact on China and on Europe, it also led to the impossibility of preserving much of that for too long. Up until the 6th century, the peoples of Central Asia were mostly speakers of Iranian languages. Both the more sedentary and the nomadic tribes spoke various Iranian languages, but all of that changed from the 6th century onwards as Turkic peoples showed up. The demographics changed too. Up until the 7th century, the Eurasian steppe was mostly inhabited by Indo-European groups with dominant West Eurasian ancestry. As time went by, the region became very heterogeneous. Some researchers put this development on the spread of Islam, but that's not exactly correct. Islam reached the region in the 8th century and didn't become dominant until the 10th century. Meanwhile, the shift in demographics started 2 centuries earlier. The much bigger demographic impact was the Turkic migration of the 6th to 7th century and the 13th century Mongolian invasion. Both of those, however, had no significant impact in the cultural landscape, though the former ended up changing the language gradually. This changed again in the 16th century when Russia showed up. For 300 years, Russia and China fought on who will own Central Asia. Eventually, the region was divided into 4. The western part went to the Soviet Union, the eastern part went to China, today's Xinjiang province, Mongolia ended up quasi-independent but heavily Soviet-influenced, and Afghanistan remained independent because it was way too difficult to rule. In the case of Afghanistan, things changed in 1978 with the Saur Revolution, which I discussed in November in the video called Managing the CSET Realignment. During the Soviet rule, anything that did survive from the local culture was heavily suppressed. Millions died in various famines, some intentionally organized by the USSR, others more as a result of incompetence or the inherent limitations of central planning, and millions more were deported into the region. Oh, and let's not forget the deportation of entire nationalities. The entire population of Volga Germans, Ukrainian Greeks, Crimean Tatars, Kurds, and other minorities in the USSR were deported from their homelands to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Some were accused of collaboration with the enemy, while others were deported, quote, for their own safety, unquote, and I wish I were joking. This remained the official policy until the fall of the USSR. Nobody ever paid any reparations to any of these people groups, even though survivors of that policy are still alive today, albeit very old and difficult to access. And when I say difficult to access, I don't just mean physically, as many of them live in remote villages, but also linguistically. Here's a woman speaking Koreomar, a dialect of Korean spoken in Uzbekistan.
안녕하신도 이렇게 우리 집으로 오니까 반갑습니다. 정말 이렇게 찾아올 줄 난 몰랐습니다. 네, 1947년도에 연결 왔습니다. 우즈베키스탄에서 내 85살 삽니다.
Why is there a Korean minority in Uzbekistan? Well, because Stalin said so. And on like that it goes. The whole Soviet period is one tragedy after another. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union conducted multiple killings, imprisonments, one mass starvation event, and two small-scale starvation events. Central Asia, however, was the Gulag, Kazakhstan in particular. This is where the humanitarian tragedies were scheduled to occur. Out of sight, out of mind. Nobody saw them, nobody could speak of them, so therefore they didn't happen. As cynical as this sounds, this is how the USSR behaved around here. And many of these stories will forever remain untold. As I was walking up and down the streets of Toshkent looking for history books about Uzbekistan, I realized after many refusals that we'll probably never know most of what happened. And with the exception of Kazakhstan, there isn't much effort to even try to learn. So there's that. When it comes to geopolitics, Central Asia resembles quite a bit with Europe, namely that it's a region governed by a patchwork of Byzantine treaties and exceptions initially made to make trade easier, but which in practice, as always, make things in fact far more complicated. So, the geopolitical architecture is built around the former Soviet Union through something called the Commonwealth of Independent States, an organization created after the fall of the USSR. All countries of the former USSR, except Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, joined at first the new organization. Over the last 30-plus years since then, however, things became a lot more complicated. So, within the CIS, there is something called the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which was supposed to be Russia's version of NATO. As you can see in the graph, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Tadjikistan, Russia, and Belarus are part of it. The viability of this organization was heavily contested throughout 2022 after the CSTO turned out to be impotent on defending Armenia in its conflict with Azerbaijan and also in preventing the conflict between member states Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan over their long border conflict which they inherited from the USSR. Within the CSTO, there is such thing called the Eurasian Economic Union, which includes all CSTO members except Tajikistan. The EEU is arguably the only portion of this whole supranational agreement that actually works. Goods and services within the Union do indeed flow slightly freer and slightly easier than outside of it, though increasingly the benefits no longer outweigh the costs. What costs? Well, as the graph shows and logic would dictate, as a member of the EEU, your trade is dominated by Russia, or legally by something called the Union State, which is an ever closer union of integration between member states in economic and defense policy. If that sounds like the language of the European Union, it's because that's exactly what the inspiration is. Russia and Belarus, as part of the Union state, do not have a border between them, kind of like Schengen. Their currencies are instantly convertible between them, and their their defense policies are also integrated. The latter part was somewhat demonstrated during the escalation of the Russian-Ukrainian war, when the Kremlin launched several attacks from the territory of Belarus. And then there is the CIS-FTA, which de facto barely exists anymore. It was created mostly to offer some free trade arrangements with the countries of the former Soviet Union that were already quite skeptical of the arrangement, namely Ukraine, Moldova, and Uzbekistan. For the purposes of this series, Uzbekistan's case is of interest. Uzbekistan is part of many regional arrangements with Russia and Kazakhstan, and is in the process of creating some more of them with Kazakhstan in particular. However, Uzbekistan has staunchly been refusing any integration when it comes to defense, hence why they're not part of the CSTO, and also refuse to abide by provisions that would make trade with Europe more difficult. And you can see this in practice in the cities of Uzbekistan. There's much higher European presence in Uzbekistan than everywhere else in Central Asia. We'll go a lot into those details about that during the series. And then there's Turkmenistan, which, as you can see on the graph, is not part of any regional architecture, staying firm on its isolationist commitments, in part because the regime in Ashgabat remains a very closed one, similar to North Korea, except you can leave legally if you can afford to, and entering the country is marginally easier than DPRK, though not significantly easier. So, that's the bird's eye view. Now, a few words about every country in Central Asia. Let's start with the big one, the Republic of Kazakhstan. Geographically immense, but sparsely populated. The population of Kazakhstan is about the same size as Romania. About 19 million people live here, but on a surface area more than 11 times greater. The trip to the city Karaganda has made me understand why Stalin chose this place to be the main headquarters of the Gulag system. The climate in the northern part of the country is terrifying. In the middle of the summer, temperatures rarely go higher than 15 degrees Celsius during daytime. Between September and April, the temperature almost never goes above freezing level, with minus 25 Celsius being the absolute norm. And then there's the wind. I thought I knew Soviet wind, and I had been in the past to Astana, which is just a bit over 200 kilometers north from here. So I thought I knew the steppe wind too. Well, no. The steppe wind in Karagandskaya Oblast is a special thing. What people in Ukraine, Romania, or Poland know as the Russian wind is pretty bad, but the steppe buran wind is a lot worse. I had a Kazakh guy explain to me how in the wintertime the snow falls to about 5 meters tall and then stays there for months. He was in town here in Karaganda visiting relatives and then heading back to Bishkek. He had moved there for climate reasons. His father was a son of deportees. The southern part of Kazakhstan is a different thing altogether, which is why more people are concentrated here, including the Almata metropolis. Winters are mild here, much milder than Romania or Ukraine, but the summers are Iraq style. While I was in Almata, I was reading about the harsh heat wave hitting Iraq and central Iran, with temperatures going as high as 50 degrees Celsius. Well, that was colder than in Almaty. Every day that I spent here, except one, came with temperatures between 40 degrees Celsius early in the morning and 54 Celsius around noontime. And since streetlights aren't exactly a thing here, I had to stay out during daytime if I wanted to both speak with people and videotape as much as possible. Heck, now that I think about it, I took quite a health risk just taping these images. But then again, you can't learn much about this region unless you take such risks, and it was definitely much better than the risks Armin Vambery had to take in the past. Officially, Kazakhstan is a democracy. In practice, well, it's not exactly a democracy, but not exactly a dictatorship either. Let's call it a hybrid benevolent autocracy. The benevolent part started in 2022 after the Almaty riots. In January 2022, something unexpected happened. The price of liquefied petroleum gas went up by a few cents. LPG has always been cheap in this country, and it was still cheap even after the rise. But enough people didn't like it. And before you knew it, enough people suddenly didn't like the whole regime. The country has been ruled by this guy, Nursultan Nazarbayev, from independence to 2019 officially. De facto, he had retained the leadership role until 2022, even though officially the new president was this guy, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Nazarbayev's corruption, obscene wealth, and Soviet-style authoritarianism has been at odds with popular expectations for years.
Открывай памятник! Открывай! Открывай, ребята!
Shalket, or Old Man Leave, became a popular slogan by 2016 and the norm at all protests until January 2022, the final protest. Shalket also marks the world premiere, the first and so far the only slogan launched by feminists that actually turned out to be popular. The January 2022 protests were also dubbed as Gazovaya Revolutsiya of Kazakhstan, or the Gas Revolution of Kazakhstan. The name was given straight up in Russian because, well, Russian is still the language here. There's tremendous push to increase the prominence of Kazakh in public, but as I observed in the field, the progress is slow. As a norm, regular people talk to each other in Russian, especially if they're at the first encounter. But that's a story for another episode. Long story short, the new president initially took the usual Soviet stance.
Призывы атаковать служебные помещения гражданских и военных ведомств являются абсолютно незаконными. Это преступление, за которым может последовать наказание. Власть не падет.
Then, later on, he turned into Ion Iliescu. Here's him on January the 6th, 4 days into the protests.
Обращает на себя внимание высокая организованность хулиганствующих элементов. Это свидетельствует о тщательно продуманном плане действий заговорщиков, которые мотивированы финансово. Именно заговорщиков. Поэтому, как глава государства, из сегодняшнего дня председатель Совета Безопасности намерен действовать максимально жестко. Это вопрос безопасности наших граждан, которые обращаются с многочисленными просьбами ко мне защитить их жизнь и жизнь их семей. Это вопрос и безопасности нашего государства. Уверен, народ меня поддержит. Что бы ни было, я буду находиться в столице. Это моя конституционная обязанность – быть вместе с народом.
But the protesters did not relent, and the protests didn't stop. They got bigger. Scared, Tokayev invoked the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is the Russian-led military alliance. The Russian army got onto the streets to quell the rioting. It sort of worked, in a way, but also really precipitated a change that few could have predicted. Suddenly, President Tokayev takes the most spectacular U-turns and gives an ultimatum to the Russian troops. Leave within 3 days or you are in trouble. This was unheard of. An autocrat whose rule has just been saved by Russian troops to suddenly turn against Russia? Unheard of. And yet that's exactly what happened. Remember, this was before the commencement of the second Russian invasion in Ukraine. Long story short, the post-protest country is going through transformations that were simply unimaginable a year ago. I will go a lot more into details in episode 5, but here I'll mention the fundamentals. Suddenly, Tokayev's and government's conferences switched almost entirely in Kazakh. Criticism of government became openly encouraged. In the words of Tokayev himself, quote, "We should become a listening state, one that listens to the concerns and aspirations of the people and does something about it," unquote. And lo and behold, some of that actually happened in the following months. More schools in Kazakh language were opened. Russian is no longer mandatory in primary school. The country took a West-leaning position on the war in Ukraine. It offers shelter to those who flee Putin, and overall, the level of tension between the plebs and the regime is lower. Now, of course, this doesn't mean things are fully fixed. They're not. In June 2022, a constitutional referendum was held. About a third of the Kazakh constitution was amended. Minor stuff, but also changed the way the office of the president is counted. So in November 2022, snappy presidential elections took place in order to comply with the new constitutional amendments, but also to bolster Tokayev's legitimacy. He won re-election by over 81%, but protests about the election were met with crackdowns, a lot less violent than in January 2022, but nevertheless a sign that there's still much to do until Kazakhstan can be called a free country. One thing is certain though, it's a much freer country now than it was merely 3 years ago, or heck, even 12 months ago. Fun fact, on the presidential ballot there is also the option to vote against all candidates. Tokayev got 81.3%, against all candidates got 5.8%, and the rest of the candidates got less than 5%. Another fun fact, to run for president in Kazakhstan, you need to pass a language test, which consists of writing an essay on a topic proposed by the Linguistic Commission, speak for 15 minutes on a topic selected by the Commission, and read a 3-page printed text. Maybe such a policy wouldn't be too bad to apply in the West too. Okay, enough with Kazakhstan. Let's move to Uzbekistan. Now, all countries in the region are majority Muslim, but Uzbekistan is the only one that actually is Muslim. I've seen 0 mosques in Kazakhstan. Now, I know they're there, but they're just nowhere visible. And I've seen more crowded mosques in the first 5 hours in Toshkent than in the entire period spent in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So that's the first striking contrast. In Uzbekistan, you do know that you are in Dar al-Islam. It's not very overt, but it's the little things. And also some weird things, like a prayer room next to the toilet in a restaurant that sells alcohol and broadcasts secular music. The reason I mention all of this is because currently the country is creating a new mythology about itself and a new geopolitics that is Islam-centric. You see, the modern territory of Uzbekistan contains a few places that have, in the past, been civilizational centers, such as the city of Samarkand, which is among the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Central Asia, alongside Bukhara. Those places have been cities, hubs of commerce, and centers of culture and civilization for 3,000 years. And when Islam happened, that didn't change for them. They became, albeit briefly, centers of the Islamic civilization itself. You see, Islam has been through a darker period, very similar to the one happening right now, when the Islamic world rejected wisdom and knowledge and embraced violence a bit too much. The beginning of the end of that dark period happened here in Uzbekistan with something called the Timurid Renaissance. Especially this guy, Mirza Muhammad Tarahai bin Shahrukh, or Ulugh Bey. As a sultan of the Timurid Empire, he was terrible. Not in the tyrant sense, but simply incompetent. He failed to establish his power and assert his authority, and as a result, he ended up being undermined by his family, taken advantage of, and eventually overthrown and assassinated. However, as a man of culture, everyone owes him something. He compiled the star catalogue, which formed the basis for astronomical research all the way till the 1970s. He calculated the length of a year with an error of just 58 seconds. That error was only corrected when atomic clocks became a thing, hundreds of years after his death. If you're reading a document from before 1960 that contains precise dates and hours, you should thank Ulugh Bey, whose work allowed everyone to get more precise with measuring time. Keep in mind, this guy wasn't some austere scholar. He was in contact with scientists around the civilized world. You can also thank him for modern trigonometric calculus. He wrote accurate trigonometric tables for sine and tangent values correct to at least 8 decimal places, which by 1420 standards was quite impressive. The tables for that only got better more than 400 years later. So anything roundish that is still standing anywhere in the world, those who designed it relied on Ulugh Bey's work, either directly or indirectly. Now, we'll get more into that in episode 6, but until then, a word on politics. So, as I was saying earlier in the video, this country had a lot of suffering going for it for the last 100 years. The Soviet period saw its men sacrificed in the Afghanistan war, and the post-Soviet period saw the country ruled with an iron fist by this guy, Islam Abduganievich Karimov. His rule was tolerated because he was seen as a good ally in the fight against radical Islam in the region. Under Islam Karimov, the call to prayer in public was banned, the hijab was banned, they banned men from wearing beards, and hundreds of imams were imprisoned under accusations of extremism. Now, to be fair, there was an Islamist threat in the country, especially given that the country neighbors Afghanistan, but the cure was far, far, far worse than the disease. In the fight against Islamic extremism, imams promoting democratic openness were jailed, prisoners were boiled alive, torture was widespread, and so was kidnapping, murder, rape by the police, financial corruption, religious prosecution, and censorship. The entire public civilian infrastructure you can still admire today was built with surveillance in mind. Abandoned checkpoints can still be seen from time to this day, even in the middle of the cities. When Karimov was ruling, freedom of movement was non-existent. The immense state security apparatus would physically control the movement of almost everyone, which in a country of 30 million people wasn't an easy task. In many ways, Karimov was a combination between Ceausescu, except the starvation part, Kim Jong-il, except you could leave the country if you could afford it, and Enver Hoxha, except for the gulags. But Uzbekistan never had a Ceausescu moment. Islam Karimov simply died. On September 2nd, 2016, it was simply announced that he died of a stroke after having been in critical condition for several days. The funeral was what you would expect for a dictator of this caliber. He was buried in Samarkand in this immense complex built specifically for this purpose, just 1 kilometer away from the UNESCO heritage site Registon. And that's where things started changing. For starters, the successor turned out to be this guy, Shavkat Miromonovich Mirziyoyev, the least likely successor. Yes, he had been prime minister before, but he was regarded as a geek and definitely lacking the gravitas to take over. But he did. And although it's been 6 years since then, the country lives in a perpetual interregnum. Things are changing, mostly for the better, but there's still a lot of tension because the way the public would look at the regime changed literally overnight. From daily messaging from the government and the portrait of the president in every store, on every street, and in every institution, plus statues of the president freaking everywhere, to silence. The joke ran around in the first years after Karimov's death that nobody really knows how the new president even looks like. And that's not exactly wrong. The new president is a very discreet presence compared to the predecessor. Yes, he holds press conferences, he has appearance in diplomatic setting and all of that, but that's it. He showed no interest in playing a central role in the lives of citizens, which in fact made him more popular. As it turns out, the Uzbeks weren't so happy with the cult of personality after all, even though in 2016 few would have admitted that in public. Slowly but surely, the restrictions started to go away. Ironically, while a lot of the world went full fascist in 2020, Uzbekistan made most of its reforms on public life in 2020. The curfew was lifted forever in 2020. Any remaining movement control personnel and measures were removed in March 2020, though most had been lifted in January 2017, to be fair, and the pandemic was treated like any other cough. Some warnings here and there, and that's about it. Legally, slavery was abolished in 2022, though de facto only in March 2022. Yes, really, Uzbekistan ran a slavery operation on cotton picking. Now, I know that to our American friends, this sounds like a story from the 19th century, but it's a story from as late as 2019. Employees of local administrations, teachers, factory workers, state firms, and doctors were forced as a matter of course to leave their jobs every autumn for weeks at a time to pick cotton with little or no additional compensation. Those who refused to take part were threatened with punishment and dismissal from their state sector jobs. As much as 4% of the population was affected every year. Sure, it wasn't 19th century type of slavery, but the more modern kind. Anti-slavery movements started 20 years ago, and from 2005 till 2016, the response was only bullets. Multiple protesters were killed under Islam Karimov as the police opened fire on protests that questioned the practice. It's a complicated story, but the short version is that the current president was prime minister at the last bloodshed in 2016, and he was reportedly disgusted with how the state acted on the issue. For years, these reports were disbelieved, but once he came into power, he did act against slavery, so there's that. With that said, there's still tension. What is permitted? What is still forbidden? What does the new regime want? Except for the new geopolitics, although even that is fuzzy. Now, I'll try to clarify as much of it as possible in this series, but not knowing what's permitted, that's how the Karagandskaya riots happened. You see, Uzbekistan has this autonomous region where the Karagandskaya people live. Word got out that the constitution is under review, and among the changes is one that eliminates the right to secede. This autonomous region doesn't want to secede from the country, but as it turns out, it really does appreciate having that option clearly codified into law. In 2016, this would have ended in a bloodbath and a tightening of repression, like it happened in 2005 at what is now openly referred to as the Andijan massacre, when at least 400 people were killed in comparatively smaller protests than in Karagandakaya. In the summer of 2022, the situation was slightly different. 18 people died and at least 250 were injured. As opposed to 2005, there is no dispute on the number of the dead people. And also, as opposed to 2005, the regime did back down. The new president came personally to Nukus to announce that the change will not happen. Of course, like it's customary in the region, he blamed others for not informing him. But nevertheless, all things considered, the protest worked. It achieved its main objective. Now that is a first for Uzbekistan. Unfortunately, there was still a state of emergency over Karagandakaya when I was in the country, so I couldn't go there easily. Nevertheless, it should be noted that this region is the poorest, and part of that is because of the state, more specifically, the draining of the Aral Sea. Despite the name, the Aral Sea wasn't a sea, but a huge lake with drinking water. The disappearance of this lake is one of the biggest environmental disasters in the modern history, and you can thank the Soviet Union for it. The USSR messed things up, and the Karagandakaya people are paying the price, and post-Soviet Uzbekistan is left to deal with the aftermath, specifically the collapse in the standard of living for the whole region. So there's that. Next, Kyrgyzstan. This place, as I've described it in the summer, is the epitome of functional random. It's the only democracy in the region because it cannot function otherwise. The history of Kyrgyzstan is one less flattering than what you discover here in the National History Museum. Most of the elements in this museum are true, but placed in a context that did not exist. In reality, the place we now call Kyrgyzstan has a history of warlords who tried, and oftentimes succeeded, to take advantage of the fact that their land was at the intersection of more powerful empires. That's it. Very little civilizational aspirations beyond that. Writing came here with the Russian Empire and only became a thing after 1928. The relationship with the Soviet Union was one of love-hate. On one hand, the USSR's policies of intentionally discouraging the nomadic lifestyle and collectivizing agriculture were deeply despised, not only because they were leading to a lot of death and suffering, but also because they were perceived as destroying the Kyrgyz way of life. Both of these considerations were correct, but not enough to establish any serious opposition, especially after the failed uprising from 1916. And that's because the elite had fewer things to reproach to Moscow. In many ways, Kyrgyzstan was a net beneficiary, at least from the perspective of the elites. While in many places the USSR killed off or deported the elites, in Kyrgyzstan the USSR helped or propped up the elites by creating a cultural life where none had existed, by improving literacy, by supporting local authors, and all sorts of goodies that were appreciated by the nascent elites. And you can see that this continues to be the case through the fact that there's Lenin statues all over the place. The streets in smaller towns are still called Sovietskaya Ulitsa, Komsomolskaya, Lenina, and so on and so forth. As opposed to pretty much every other ex-Soviet country, oftentimes including Russia itself, in Kyrgyzstan these things do not elicit an immediate sentiment of revulsion. Osman Akum Ibrahimov writes in the General History of the Kyrgyz state that the consensus pretty much remains that Russian occupation was far from stellar, but all things considered, it wasn't that bad for Kyrgyzstan since it brought writing, a national identity, and outright created the Kyrgyz cultural life. It should be noted here that up until Stalin, the idea of a unified Kyrgyz national identity simply did not exist in a meaningful way, an aspect that can be quite surprising for many, but it just is what it is. So in many ways, the history of Kyrgyzstan is the history from 1991 onwards, and a lot of it is connected to the mess inherited from the USSR. Uzbekistan inherited a natural disaster that's making its western part unstable to this day. Kyrgyzstan inherited border problems with both Uzbekistan and Tadjikistan. If you take a closer look at the map, even the one on Google Maps, which tries to stay as politically neutral as possible, you will notice some weird things. I mentioned at the beginning of the video the splitting of Turkestan. Well, the same can be said about this sub-region called the Fergana Valley, where the divide is similar with Kyrgyzstan having drawn the short end of the stick. The cities are in Uzbekistan, the villages are in Kyrgyzstan. But over time, the bigger troubles ended up being with Tajikistan to the south in the sub-region called Batken. It's a classical post-colonial issue. The borders drawn by the Soviets in the period 1924 to 1936, without taking into account economic, geographical, and ethnic realities, led to serious problems among those countries. The enclaves that are located in a region belonging to another country that is between the use of water resources and the territory of one country have brought the countries of the region against each other. And in a hot way too. First, as between May and June 1990, the Uzbeks living in Osh, which is in Kyrgyzstan, faced the Kyrgyz. At least 300 people lost their lives in that conflict. Hundreds of houses were also destroyed. Now, keep in mind, these places are very poor, so having your house set on fire is an event that effectively sentences you to life in poverty. And since then, there have been 11 such conflicts. Not all of them with so many damages, but still. In the conflict that occurred in June 2010, there were more than 400 casualties from both sides. During this conflict, which lasted for just 5 days, as many as 2,843 houses and businesses were burned down in Osh, Jalalabad, and Bazar-Kurgan cities. In between these, there were also the 2005 Tulip Revolution, which in many ways resembled the 2009 revolution in Moldova. Now, I've compared Kyrgyzstan with Moldova multiple times, but if the shoe fits, the capital city Bishkek is effectively a slightly bigger Chisinau, and until 1991 it was called Frunze after the Bolshevik leader Mikhail Frunze, the son of a Russian housewife and the Romanian Moldovan paramedic. Anyway, the Tulip Revolution started with allegations of fraud during the 2005 parliamentary election, and it ended with the resignation of the president, who had been running the country since independence. He wrote his resignation letter from Russia. That also set up a pattern. In 2010, another leader was forced to resign by popular uprising, and then again in 2020. In 2020, former MP Sadyr Japarov was freed from prison by protesters on October the 5 and was nominated as interim prime minister by parliament 5 days later. The vote took place more or less at gunpoint. Within 10 days, the incumbent resigned, left the country, and the protesters' preferred figure was installed. Then a few weeks later, fresh elections were organized. The protesters' preferred figure won in an election that everyone, the West, Russia, and China, agreed it was fair and transparent. So that's why Kyrgyzstan is a democracy. You can't have authoritarianism here. You will be physically removed from office the second you piss off the populace, and they're pretty trigger-happy too. That's the uplifting part. The less fun part is that the reason Kyrgyzstan functions that way is because no matter who is installed to power, authoritarian reflexes are all too common, which leads to recurring revolutions. Now, I'll get back to that during episodes 9, 10, and 11. But until then, I will say this. If not for Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan will be the butt of all jokes in Central Asia. They're not mocked for their democracy, but for their way of doing things, which breeds instability. Now, of course, one can argue that instability isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when sandwiched between China and Russia, perhaps not having a revolution every 10 years or so isn't the worst idea. With that said, given the propensity towards abuse by almost every crop of politicians that run Kyrgyzstan so far, I have to say I understand the people. In 2022, Kyrgyzstan reached a critical deal with Tadjikistan over most of the disputed border, an important step towards ending the cycles of wars in the south. Naturally, as in any democracy, there were people who disagreed. Some of them vehemently so. The current government's response was to arrest them all. They remain in jail at the moment of this recording, so we shouldn't be surprised if in 2023 yet another revolution will occur. Time and time again, the Kyrgyz people have made it clear that they will not stand for rigged elections and for imprisoning the opposition. I guess they need to explain this again to politicians, and there's little doubt that they will. Alright, now let's drop a few words about the other two countries that I did not visit this time round. Although this video is getting long, it is worth discussing the other two because they are an integral part of the region and are likely to be in the news in the next few years. After all, you don't come to Freedom Alternative for tourism, but for news before it's news, among other things. Maybe a tiny bit for tourism too. So, Tajikistan. Now, finding footage for these last two segments that won't get my channel into trouble is not going to be easy, so let's keep this short. Tajikistan is your garden variety post-Soviet autocracy. Ruled by President Emomali Rahmon since 1994, human rights abuses and corruption are widespread, although things have gotten better over the last 5 or 6 years as the regime is preparing for transition. Mr. Rahmon wants to leave his son in charge, similar to how Lukashenko in Belarus would want to leave his son in charge. What makes Tajikistan special is that the dominant language, Tajik, is an Iranian language rather than a Turkic one, like in the rest of Central Asia. It is widely believed that Tajik is the closest language to what people used to speak all over Central Asia before the 6th century. Its geopolitics is also a bit special. The country is part of the CSTO and the regime is very Russia-friendly, but it is also part of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and NATO's Partnership for Peace. Most recently, just a couple of months ago, President Rahmon made the rounds on the internet by outright lecturing Putin on respect, a monologue that shocked most political observers.
Нет. На уровне замминистра. Вот Таджикистан заслужил это. Стратегический партнер. А что? Вот что мы что не так поступаем? У нас обучается 2,5 миллиона школьников русскому, так учебники, не хватает учебники. 30 лет об этом мы говорим, не хватает до сих пор. Учебники не хватает. У нас обязательно изучать русского языка с детского сада. Так? Что там мы делаем? Военные базы есть, полигоны так как были, так и остались. Все, у нас, вот спасибо, вы меня извините, 30 тысяч, сейчас мы не будем называть их беженцами, или перемещенные русскоязычные, вернулись к нам, они передают по всему миру. Вот это не мигранты, там и самые трудовые самые. Смотрите, вот мы в Таджикистане так, показывают по всему миру и передают из Таджикистана реальную информацию. Ну, из нас сделали так, что мы страны, которые, не знаю, да, мы малые народы. Нас не 100 миллионов, не 200 миллионов, но у нас есть история, культура, мы любим. Мы хотим, чтобы нас уважали. Ничего не надо. Уважали. Мы не нищие. Мы не нищие. У нас богатая страна. Запасы минеральных ресурсов больше, чем система Менделеева. Я свидетель, все бизнесмены из России только сливки. Что есть углеводородное сырье, нефть и газ интересуют их. Нефть и газ. Давайте, где нефть и газ, там. А почему горнорудной промышленности, цветной металлургии, так? Драгоценные металлы, драгоценные камни, и очень много. И даже стратегическое сырье для военных, которых нет в мире. Я вам рассказывал, когда вы были у меня. По запасам Таджикистан занимает первое место. Никого не интересует. Ну давайте, вот мы собрались, давайте создадим условия. Где что-то мы нарушили, где-то мы с кем не так поздоровались. Ну здороваться будем. Но мы никогда не нарушали. Как бы всегда уважаем интересы своего главного стратегического партнера. Ну хотим, чтобы нас уважали. Мы хотим, чтобы наравне с африканскими странами, мы видим, с другими странами. А что, мы какие-то чужеземцы или какие-то самые, что ли? Ну давайте. И вкладывать много денег не надо вкладывать. Вот в наших странах. Да, надо вкладывать. Надо вкладывать. Миллиарды, которые можно это как бы за короткий срок окупается. Во всех сферах. Ведь наши трудовые мигранты к вам, выезжают к вам, они работают, а так просто не зарабатывают, они работают же.
Now, how did this happen? Well, for starters, Mr. Rahmon is 70 and won't be alive for much longer. Secondly, he survived an assassination attempt and 2 attempted coups during his long reign, so he's not really that easy to scare. Thirdly, his country and his regime is deeply indebted to China, not to Russia, so he's under much bigger threat from Beijing than from Moscow. Inside the country, Mr. Rahmon, he removed the Russian-style ending "ov" from his surname and the patronymic Sharipovich from his name altogether. Following this move, scores of government officials, members of parliament, and civil servants around the country also removed their Russian-style patronymic and "ov" endings from their surnames. And finally, in April 2016, Tajikistan officially banned giving Russian-style patronymics and surnames to newborn children. So, as I was saying, inside the country, Mr. Rakhmonov has mandatory opinions about a lot of things. The country is 98%-ish Muslim, yet in Tajikistan, beards are banned, so is attendance at mosques for women and children under 18, and Hajj or pilgrimage is also haram for people under 40. Studying in Islamic schools outside Tajikistan is also absolutely haram, and so is the production, import, or export of Islamic books without permission. Using loudspeakers to broadcast the adhan, like in Kyrgyzstan, is also not permitted. Veils, madrasas, Islamist political parties, and Arabic-sounding names are also forbidden. Furthermore, mosques are heavily regulated, providing unofficial Islamic teaching can lead to up to 12 years of imprisonment, and an arduous process is required to obtain a permit to establish an Islamic organization, publish an Islamic book, or go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, to be fair, some of these regulations, although not quite that harsh, also exist in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. They come from the fact that Afghanistan is nearby. Now, nobody wants to become an Islamic theocracy, I suppose. Much of the contemporary politics of Tajikistan is the result of a document called the General Agreement on the Establishment of Peace and National Accord in Tajikistan, which is the document that ended the civil war that ravaged the country for 5 years between 1992 and 1997. 1.2 million people were internally displaced during the conflict. At least 40,000 were killed, and the economic damage left the country dysfunctional for a decade at the very least. Until 2001, Tajikistan was one of the most dangerous countries for journalists in the world, competing with war zones in Yugoslavia or Afghanistan. Things had gotten so bad that even North Korea-style autocracy of Turkmenistan and Russia itself agreed to call the United States to help broker a peace deal. Now, to be fair, the peace deal did hold. Here we are 25 years later. Rahmon is still president, but the killing has long stopped. And in 2022, the country opened up for the rest of the world, though logistically it's still difficult to get into the country, which is why I didn't this time around, but I know I have to get here sooner or later. The war was started by Islamists in conjunction with reformers and liberal Democrats. So you can guess why liberal democracy and overt expressions of Islam are not permitted or heavily regulated to this day. Opposition is legal, unlike Turkmenistan, and they do have seats in the parliament, but the elections are far from free and fair, so the opposition can rarely hope to gain any relevant power. Access to food remains a serious problem in the country, even though the place is rich. It has literal gold mines, it's one of the biggest aluminum producers in the world, and has hundreds of documented deposits of all sorts of relevant minerals such as zinc, graphite, bituminous coal, precious stones, silver, mercury, and so on and so forth. But corruption and perilous quote-unquote cooperation with the CCP prevents most of that wealth from even being used in the first place, and the one that is extracted usually gets into the pockets of Chinese contractors and the Rahmon family. So there's that. There's a lot to discuss, and I'll get back to this in episode 14. Until then, a few words on Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is the motherland of neutrality, is the official motto of the country, and it shows. The country is not part of the CIS or CSTO or any security architecture. Even getting into Turkmenistan is a complicated adventure, and internet in the country is simply not a thing. The place was known internationally for the eccentricity of its first president for life, Sapar Murat Niyazov, also known as Turkmenbashi, or head of the Turkmens, who made a statue of himself that would rotate after the sun. The place is also known for this, the Darvaza crater, or the Gates of Hell. It was originally thought to be a substantial oil field site. The Soviet engineers set up a drilling rig and operations to assess the quantity of oil available at the site. Soon after the preliminary survey found a natural gas pocket, the ground beneath the drilling rig and camp collapsed into a wide crater, and the rig was buried with the collapse. Fearing dangerous releases of poisonous gases from the cavern into nearby towns, the engineers considered it advisable to burn the gas off. It was estimated that the gas would burn out within a few weeks, but lo and behold, the experts were wrong, and this remains as yet another environmental disaster left by the Soviet Union to a post-Soviet country to deal with. Not as bad as the Aral Sea disaster in Uzbekistan, but pretty bad nonetheless. Turkmenistan is the kind of autocracy that others in the ex-Soviet Union would wish to have. And I compare it with the DPRK because, just like DPRK managed to do the transition of power twice already, and it has the hereditary aspect attached to it. So, following the death of President for Life Turkmenbashi, his place was taken by this guy, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, the de facto vice president. Of course, he ruled like a tyrant, but believe it or not, he was in fact less bad. Niyazov had renamed the months of the year and the days of the week after his relatives. The second president restored that, abolished the right of the president to rename landmarks and cities, eased travel restrictions, reopened libraries in rural areas, and abolished a lot of the mandatory personality cult practices that resembled too much like North Korea. With that said, he also ordered any vehicle not white be impounded in the capital city. As you can see in the footage, Ashgabat, the capital, is the city of white marble, because the president thought that white is a color that brings luck. I wish I were joking. In 2019, it was rumored that he died, so he drove around the gates of hell and did donut stunts to prove that he's alive. The country ranks 165th out of 180 in economic freedom and 178th in press freedom, only above Eritrea and North Korea. So in this climate, in March 2022, the president stepped down and a sham snap election was held that was won by his son, Serdan Gurbangulyevich Berdimuhamedov. Everyone agrees that the election of Serdar was neither free nor fair, so there's that. With this so-called election, we now have the first country in Central Asia to have a hereditary autocracy. Many had hoped, foolishly, that Serdar being younger may mean a less repressive regime, if not a more liberal one. Now, admittedly, it hasn't even been a year since he's been in power, but so far he resembles the Taliban a bit more than he resembles even Tadjikistan. The comparison with the Taliban is not by accident either. The new president was the first Central Asian leader to accept the diplomats of the Taliban government of Afghanistan, and he did that in his first day in office. Also, a week into his term, he introduced new public behavior rules, mostly on the behavior of women. Manicures, for instance, were forbidden. So was traveling for women with men to whom they're not related, with the exception of taking a taxi, but only if the woman stays in the back. And if that doesn't make any sense, it's because it's not supposed to. Episode 13 of this series, dedicated to Turkmenistan, will be the second hardest to make, after this one, of course. So stay tuned. But by the time I get to that one, a lot more eccentric stuff will happen in the country, so it should be fun. But I'm serious when I say that this was the hardest episode to make, and the main reason why the series starts 3 months after I came back from Central Asia. The second reason is, of course, that going through the pile of books takes time. So yeah, this is the shortest overview that I can offer to Central Asia without going too much into details. The next 15 episodes will be about details. Not so many as to have the videos too long, but enough of them so that by the end of this series, you, the dear viewer, will have a good enough understanding about what Central Asia is politically, socially, and economically. The next episode will be about the history of Kazakhstan up to the incorporation into the Soviet Union. And in episode 4, we'll discuss at length the Gulag in Kazakhstan. But until then, thanks a lot for watching. Many thanks to the donors who made this series possible and generally make everything possible here on Freedom Alternative. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you like what we do, please consider joining the donor circle. See you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.